difficult to interpret the motives of people. When I was 6 years old, I had a friend, and I went over to his house to play one day. And while I was there, his older brother and one of his brother's friends was there. And at that time, there was this type of candy. It looked like rocks. It came in a little sack, and everybody seemed to want to have it. One of those fads that kids go through. And I remember that my friend's brother reacted when his friend somehow dropped the rocks out of his sack, and he dove for them. Now I decided to do something that every 6-year-old kid would do. I went and I tattled. I said, "He's trying to steal his candy." Well, the mother went in and asked a few more questions and found out he wasn't trying to steal the candy. He was just trying to help him pick it all up. I completely misread the motives that was happening at that particular time. If you can imagine trying to do that with God, it's almost impossible, but we do it anyway. We try to read into what our life is going through, and we read into it what we think God is trying to do with it. We feel something, and whatever we feel, we try to say, this is the reason why God is letting this happen to me. And it usually happens at the worst possible times of our life, when we're hurting, when we're struggling, when life is kicking us in some way. And so it is that the Hebrew writer decides he needs to help them clarify what's going on in their own lives. After all, one of their problems is they are going through this suffering for their faith. They are being persecuted. The problem is that they're forsaking the faith into comfort, thinking that that is the best position. But they're missing the point of what's happening. And that's what the Hebrew writer wants to try to explain to them in chapter 12, beginning with verse 5. It's all about the problem of evil. We wonder why evil happens. You know, there are wars, there's famines. We're living through this COVID-19 thing right now, and people say, I don't understand why this is happening to us. It shouldn't be. There's that word, shouldn't. It shouldn't be. I don't understand this. And then it quickly moves over and says, why does God allow this to happen? See, if God could stop it, why does he allow it? That's a hard question. And a lot of people try to give glib answers. But the easiest answer is usually the wrong one, or at least the shallow one. And the Hebrew writer wants to explain this problem. But the problem is as old as time. It's as current as the morning day or as ancient as mankind itself. The first time, if you think about it, if you go back before Abraham, long before Abraham, there was a man who lived whose name was Job. Job was a righteous man who was very well blessed. He had great children. He was very wealthy with flocks, herds, and camels. He had so many things. He had his health, and everything about him just exuded the blessings of God. And he feared God and believed him. But the story opens in heaven with God and the devil having a discussion. And God brings up Job, said, have you noticed my servant Job, how faithful he is? And the devil says, well, of course he is. You built a hedge around him. You've given him all the gifts in the world. You have blessed his life in so many ways. It's no wonder he serves you. If you took that away, if you withdrew that from his life, he would curse you. God says, then go do your worst and we'll see. And the devil did. He took his ugly finger and began to touch his life in an ugly scrawl. A servant came in and said, raiding marauders have stolen all of your flocks and herds and your camels. There are none left. As soon as he leaves, another breathless servant comes in. He says, all of your servants were together in one place and they were struck by lightning and they're all dead. And with that one comes a third one, with tears in his eyes. Said, Master, your children, They were all having a feast in a single place. And a windstorm came and a tower fell on them, and they're all gone. And then the devil touched his life. He gave him these sores, these boils, that the only way he could get relief from the itches was to take broken pieces of a pot and on the sharp edges scrape the boils. Job's life had been turned upside down. He lived with an assumption. The assumption was the righteous are rewarded, the wicked are punished. That's the way it ought to be. That's the reason. That's the rationale. That's the logic. The reason people are blessed is because they are righteous, and the people who are not blessed are those because they are wicked. Suddenly his life gets turned upside down. The righteous are being punished, and the wicked are prospering. How do you make sense out of that? Job's friends come and they say, well, it's obvious you've done something wrong. You've done something to offend God. You need to repent. He said, how can I repent? I don't know what I've done. I need God to come down here and tell me what I have done, and then I'll do something about it. But this is unfair because I don't think I've done anything. Sound familiar? Job is saying what we all say at times in our life. I don't understand, and it's not fair. And then comes a more modern story, the one of Charles Templeton. In the 1940s, there were two young evangelical preachers who were going to go out on the preaching circuit, holding campaigns in major cities in the United States. They were roommates. They had known each other for a long time. They dreamed together. One's name was Billy Graham. His roommate's name was Charles Templeton. And of the two, Templeton was the better preacher. For a while, he had a television program on CBS dealing with Christianity. And it all worked real well until he looked at the Look magazine in 1 month. Look was one of those glossy photographic journalism pieces that were popular in the 1950s and 60s. He looked at the cover, and the issue was about the famine in Ethiopia. And on the cover was a picture of a mother holding the body of her dead child who had died of starvation because of the famine. Templeton could not stop thinking about that child and that mother and that magazine. He started trying to make sense out of it all, but he couldn't. He started reasoning. He said, why did the child die? The child died because it didn't have enough food. Why was there not enough food? Because of the famine. Why was there a famine? Because it had not rained. And who controls the rain? God does. Suddenly it hit him. How can a God say he loves us when he will not do something just as simple as send the rain so a child will not die? What kind of God is it that withholds rain from a dying child? And with that, he left. He walked away from the faith. He wrote a book later that would try to explain his departure. You see, he was wrestling with the same problem, the problem of what happens when evil comes in our midst. How do you make sense of that? What does it mean? What is God doing? It's a good question because we always believe that God is in control. But then why does it seem the world seems so much out of control? Why doesn't God do something to fix it? Because that's what we expect him to do. And so the Hebrew writer says, let's tackle that for you. you those who are suffering for your faith, those who are being sown in the skins of lions, who are dying on crosses, who are having properties confiscated, children killed. How do you make sense out of this? You need to get a different perspective. And he's been trying to bolster their faith. First, he tells them about all of these heroes of the faith that we read about in Hebrews chapter 11. Then he goes on to say, you need to fix your eyes on Jesus. He's gone first. He suffered in ways that you'll never have to suffer, for reasons you'll never have to suffer. Follow him. But now he gets to the nitty gritty of, here's the reason why you're feeling what you feel. So what does it all mean? Well, an infant lives in its world at a very small level. It only sees what's in front of it. We have a 1-year-old grandson. We have to be very careful about what is around because he puts everything in his mouth, things we don't even see. I mean, he goes out in the yard, he's fascinated by a blade of grass, but he also may put a rock or dirt in his mouth. He'll collect fuzz all over the house, it seems like. And that's the reason is because children only see what's immediate to them. As you grow up, you begin to miss those things because you have this bigger picture of life. You see so many different things. The tragedy is we have an infantile form of spirituality. Everything is immediate with us. We need to feel good now. It's like an infant who has a diaper that's wet or a stomach that's empty. They cry because they say, I am uncomfortable now. Does that not describe us at times? If I'm uncomfortable, God needs to do something about it. And so it is with the Hebrews. They're trying to struggle with why do they feel what they feel? And how do they deal with the suffering that they have? And there are two different perspectives you can take. One perspective is that God's out to get you. In the 17th century, one of the stars of the century was a man named Jonathan Edwards. He was a Puritan preacher, and he had presented a sermon which has become an American classic called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. In it, he portrays God as a tyrant who dangles people by a gossamer thread over the pits and fires of hell, waiting for them to fall into their death. From that image, many people have their image of God. God is out to get me. God is going to pounce, punish, and pummel. He's going to destroy. And that all of the bad in life is an expression of God's wrath and God's irritation with us. And we've tried to explain natural disasters that way, diseases that way. This is God's irritation. That's why we're having to suffer. But the Hebrew writer says, while you might believe that God is out to get you, he says, the truth be told, if you're a Christian, God is out to love you. He uses a relationship of a father and a son. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 5, he says, have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline. Do not lose heart if he rebukes you. He says, have you not realized the word of encouragement that this really is? The word encourage is scattered over the New Testament. It's a word with tears in its eyes. It means to beg or to plead. When John's gospel comes along, he tells the story of Jesus, but he includes the giving of the Holy Spirit. And he calls it the Comforter, using this word. This is a word of comfort. This is something we need to understand to understand the comfort that we need in these tough times. He says, don't treat this lightly. Don't make light of this discipline. He talks about the discipline. Discipline is one of those words that and it's gotten a bad rap. It tends to be equated with pain and suffering completely for no good reason, for something that you've done wrong. Truth is, discipline is nothing more than training, and a father trains. He says, don't make light of that. Don't overlook it. Don't just kind of discard it. This is important because you have a father. The Roman father had a unique position in society. He was responsible for his children all of their lives, even when they were grown. And he had to maintain how they functioned in society. If they needed the death penalty, he had to pronounce it after a murder or something like it. But he was always responsible because a father is always the father of children. You never forget doing that. I remember as a young man with young children, I listened to Harold Hazlitt talk about parenting. Harold was a fairly famous preacher within our fellowship at that time. I was a young preacher. I was enamored of the fact of something he said that has stuck with me to this very day. He said that when his children were young, he could control them by brute force if he had to. In other words, he could use capital punishment, not capital punishment, he could use physical punishment. He could spank them, he could create problems for them. He said then they got old. They got to be 16, 17, 20 years old. He said they're bigger than I am. And I really can't do that anymore. She said, but I'm still their father. And I still need to influence them with the way I live. That's always struck me as important, that a father is always a father. However you live and however you influence can influence your children. And so the Hebrew writer talks about the father exerting the discipline on the children he loves. And it's by consequences we tend to learn. It's for some reason good instruction doesn't work as well as bad experiences. And through my life, my best lessons have been learned in the worst possible way. And that's probably true about you as well. So, what is this? What does this suffering for the Hebrews and for us mean? What happens when faith is tested in such a way that we don't like it? Well, it does a lot of things. It demonstrates a lot of things for us that the Hebrew writer wants to see. First of all, it proves that you really do have a relationship as a son. It proves your position. He says in verses 6 and 7, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as a son. Endure hardship as discipline. See, that's what he's saying. Endure the hardship as discipline. Think about this. God's treating you like his children. For are not children disciplined by their father? It's interesting that the reason we receive the discipline from God is that we are God's children. The worst thing a father can do is not to do anything for his child. Totally neglect them, never correct them, never change them, because that is not just letting them do something, that's not caring how they turn out. And when that happens, it's difficult. We would never think about if we're in a grocery store, a kid misbehaving, and we walk up and just decide we're gonna paddle them. It's a good way to get arrested or slugged, one or the other. Uh, but that's because that's somebody else's child. But if it's your child, you're going to discipline them. The discipline is the proof of the relationship that you have with them. So the Hebrew writer says, understand something. When you have to endure hardship as discipline, that's because God treats you like a son. It's a privileged position. But he goes on to say it's more than even that. He says in verse 8, he said, for if you are not disciplined, see, there's the other response. If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, true sons and daughters at all. Now, avoid the birth issues there, because the term legitimate is really in the language to mean not just who you were born to, but are you the legal heir of this? It's a case where only people who had a legitimate right to an inheritance could get it. And one of the things the father had to do, he had to give his child an inheritance. One of the inheritances that was there for a Jewish father, for instance, was he had to do two things: to teach him the law and teach him a trade. He was preparing him for life. And if you did not do those two things, you were not treating them as a child. Because what you were doing, you were preparing them for the day you would not be there and they could live their own life. This is the concept behind Abraham and Isaac. Abraham and Sarah didn't have a child, and so they went about to all great lengths to have one so they could have the promise passed on. They tried Eliezer the servant. God said, no, I'm not going to do that. And then they came up with this perfectly legal situation where Abraham had a son by his handmaiden, and Ishmael was born, and God said, he will not be it. He's not the legitimate heir. It's Isaac. It's the same thing for us. What makes us legitimate children of God is when God treats us like children and he disciplines us. And if you don't get disciplined, if you avoid all of that, it really does mean God doesn't care. So the Hebrew writer says, this is what it is. The reason, like father, like son, why do the world treat you that way? He says, because that's how they treat me. Think about how the world treats God. There's contempt, there's rejection, there's ridicule. If you're the son of the Father, why should you be any different? The second thing he says that this relationship proves is it refines your character. God cares about how you're going to turn out. Verse 10, it says, they disciplined us, our earthly fathers, for a little while as they thought best. But God disciplines us for our good. See, there's something good that's going to come out of it in order that we may share in his holiness. The term share indicates something's conferred or bestowed, not something that's earned, but something that is given to you by virtue of the giver. And the sharing of this, the bestowing of this, is he bestows upon us this ability, this relationship of specialness that reflects his character, reflects his life. And the problem is that doesn't come without cost. It comes because God does things to help us become holy. Usually those are things that are hard. Perhaps it's like this. In 1848, James Marshall found a nugget of gold in a creek bed outside of Sutter's Mill in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. It started the California Gold Rush. And thousands, 300,000 at that time, flocked to California to find their fortunes. But you didn't just walk out there and the gold was sitting on the ground. You just picked it all up. No, that wasn't it. It was buried in the silt of the river. And so they would have to pan for it. They'd have to take a pan, dip it in the river, get silt and water, and swish it around, let the water wash off the silt. And what was left after the residue is removed is the gold. See, the suffering is the process of removing the silt of our lives so that we can be what God wants us to be. It's not comfortable, but necessary. God wants to find gold in his people, but he has to remove the silt by the trials. So he says, understand, God really does want something better for you, for your good, as the Hebrew writer would say. The third thing he says is that he's preparing you for the future. Verse 11, he says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time. Isn't that true? But painful. But later on, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. The problem that he has is that there is two images here. One is the farmer. I admire farmers for a lot of reasons. I got a chance to know farmers when I was preaching out in the country, and I understand them even better than I used to. But I admire them because they're always taking a chance every year. And they plant the seed on the ground, and then suddenly they have to fight off all kinds of problems. The heat of the summer comes and drought comes. Then they have to find a way to keep the seed alive. And then comes the pest and the disease. You have to find a way to keep the crop alive. But if you do everything you need to, if you go through that very uncomfortable, very difficult process, in the end, you gain a harvest. And the harvest of peace and righteousness is the things these people really want. They want peace in their lives. They want to be righteous people, people who do the right things for the right reasons for God. Don't we all? But those things don't come easy. They come because you have endured the things that are happening in your life, and then you enjoy the harvest. But then the second metaphor kind of comes in at the end, where he says, for those who've been trained by it. And he talks about the gymnasium. That's the word for training. If you've ever had to try to get stronger, it's hard because the first day you're sore, you can barely walk. That's why most people give up. But if you can ever stand the soreness long enough, you will get stronger. And one of the things that the Hebrew writer is trying to say is you get to where you want to be if you'll go through the problems that present themselves ahead of time. It is that ability to prepare for the future. God says, I'm giving you what you need by giving you what you hate. The New York Fire Training Academy, there's a sign on the wall that every recruit sees. It says, let no man's ghost come back to say, my training let me down. It's their way of motivating people to say, one day this will make a world of difference. All of this heavy gear, all of these meaningless exercises, it seems, one day it will make a difference. Never be the time where you didn't train well and you're let down in the future. You see, everyone wants to live like God, but the paradox is that the only way to gain what we want is to experience what we hate. And through the trials of life, we prepare for a better life, but it can't be done without struggle. So the Hebrew writer has an encouragement and exhortation to them. He says, here's what you need to do. Verse 12 and 13, he says, therefore, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees. Make level paths for your feet, so the lame may not be disabled, but rather be healed. He says, you've got this strange condition. Where you are right now, you are both feeble and weak. Your limbs won't support yourselves. You're paralyzed. That's the word for weakness. It means that nothing works. He says, what's happening in your spiritual lives is you're weak. You haven't strengthened anything. You can't walk. He said, you are like a man who has suffered a stroke. And as a friend of mine said, who had one who was an active person, he said, I know what I need to do with my right arm, but it will not do it. That's true. We need to grow stronger. So he says, strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees and make level paths for your feet. He says, rebuild and restore your life. It won't get better because you run away. It will be more comfortable but less satisfying. It won't be God's life anymore. It'll be your life. Look at those who've come before. As he's pointed out, look at the faithful, how much they've paid. They were strong. Look at Jesus, how strong he was. Fix your eyes upon him. And then make your path straight. It's a word that means to walk, ortho, we get our word orthopedic, meaning straight feet, as someone who makes sure your feet go straight. And he says something's wrong with how you are walking in your life, and you need to change that. You need to stop forsaking the assembly like you've been doing. You need to stop trying to find ease and comfort. You need to stop the retreat from the problems of life because they're the things that make you strong. In his famous work on the ethics, Aristotle used the analogy of a warped piece of wood. He said, a warped piece of wood is like human nature, that in order to eliminate the warping or the curvature, a skilled woodworker slowly applies pressure in the opposite direction, essentially bending it straight. There's a lot of work we have to do like that. That's why the pain comes. That's why the difficulties come. It's bending the warped board straight. So the Hebrew writer gives the best answer. It's not more information. He knows they have what they need. It's found in how they're going to live. Repair what is damaged. Walk a straight path. That's your responsibility and mine. If you're weak, where are you weak? And what do you need to strengthen and how are you going to do it? Are you walking crooked? What gets you off the path and how do you need to get back on? Those are essential questions for people who are under pressure because it's quite easy just to fall away. So what does God let pain infiltrate our life for? It's not to destroy or harm, but to grow. The problems of life do not define us, but they do refine us. Hemingway wrote the book A Farewell to Arms, and some have said it's more descriptive of him than any other book. In it, he wrote, "The world breaks every one, and afterwards many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills." See, God says, I need to use these things to break you so you'll be strong at the broken places. The grief, the confusion, the pressure, the ridicule, the rejection, the whispers. Those are all ways to make us grow stronger rather than weaker. That's a strange idea for those who want to avoid pain or really avoiding growth. For heaven is found on a road that leads through fire. The question for the Hebrew writer poses to all of us is, are you willing to suffer the discomfort of today for the glory of tomorrow? Because you see, it takes some pain to make you safe in the end. Norfolk Southern train was barreling down the track at 24 miles an hour in the middle of Indiana. On board was the engineer, Rod Lindley, and the conductor, Robert Moore. Moore looked out, and down the track, he saw something on the track. Lindley thought it was a dog, but the closer they came, Moore said, "That's not a dog, that's a baby." A little girl who's 19 months old named Emily had wandered away from her mother while she was tending her garden. Now she was on the track, and the train was getting closer. Moore jumped off the train and began to run as fast as he could, but he realized he was never going to outrace the train. So he jumped on the front, on the grill, held on, and about the time the train got there, the baby crawled to the very middle where it's going to be crushed. And Moore took his leg, he raised it and swept it away, hit the child, and kicked it off the track onto the side of the road and jumped off the train. He went over, cradled the little girl in his arms. She had a busted lip, a gash on her forehead, but she was alive. Sometimes, just like that train conductor Robert Moore, God has to give us the pain in order to save our lives. Thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week.